I disagree with this guy a lot, but this guy's like has the best engagement. He's like responding to things that I'm saying. I feel like he's not farming for TikTok clips. And our disagreements, I think, are relatively substantive. So, Jesus, I thought this was gonna be a 30-minute screaming match. We were gonna be done. So, especially because this guy, he didn't seem like anybody that billed himself as like a foreign policy Israel-Palestine expert. It just seemed like a professor. So the fact that he seems to be like one of the best combos we've had so far for this was really shocking to me. Isn't it bad faith to say the ICJ ruling is not a point in favor of Israel? They could have made orders to stop the operations. I would say, if anything, be very cautious. I would say that the ICJ ruling is a very slight hit against Israel. My understanding, and I skimmed this, it was an 11-page report and I skimmed it, so I'm being honest, I might have missed something, but because a lot of people are saying that report said stuff that it didn't. But when I skimmed it, it seemed like the purpose of that ICJ report was to analyze the complaint from South Africa and then see prima facie, are there enough facts here, and does South Africa have the standing to bring this particular case to the ICJ? Given the facts that they presented, is it reasonable to assume that there might be a case here that the ICJ has jurisdiction under, that the South Africa has standing to bring, and that the crime of genocide might actually be being committed? And that when the ICJ looked at all of the facts, they said, well, it's plausible. There are a lot of civilian deaths. There are crazy statements by Israeli leaders. And then they looked at South Africa and they say they have reason to bring this case. They totally have standing to do it. And then from there, they think they can compel Israel to file a report at the end of the month saying like, hey, you need to prove to us that this isn't happening because we think that South Africa's made a valid argument to bring this case here. Yeah, so I would say if anything, it was like a slight point against Israel. I wouldn't say it favors them. It was just like a pre-evidentiary thing that said that, well, you know, this is possible that this is going on, is what I said, yeah. Sorry, how's it going?
Yeah.
Historical. You wanted to do the settler colonial thing, yeah.
It's a nation that is founded on ethnic cleansing. Right, and on transfer. When at every opportunity they've done both of those things. They've pleaded for the Egyptian government to receive these people. They've chided the Arab leaders for not taking more Palestinians. When at every moment when they've done that, they haven't been allowed back in. Whether it's 48, whether it's 67, and so I think a big part of this for me is the historical backdrop to it. There's literally no reason to believe that Israel's doing anything other than what it's always done. Sure. And this has been the method.
So I don't know how much time you have, and we don't have to dig into the whole history. When I look at 48, when I look at 67, and then when I look at all of the surrounding Arabs versus the basically European Jews, and I look at the history of the conflict, the way that it seems to me is that I think that Israel, if you look at early statements, whether we're talking Theodore Herzl or whether we're talking Ben-Gurion and all of the following, IDF turned prime ministers, it seems like Israel has always wanted to expand, right? Eretz Israel, I think, is what a lot of them would call it. We need to have greater Israel, this whole thing. It seemed like that was always the goal, but I think that all of the Israeli leadership has been relatively realistic in that they know that they need some sort of international ally. They know they need some sort of international community. Otherwise, Israel's in a sea alone against a bunch of enemies that will destroy her. It feels like, while I'm sympathetic towards that argument that Israel's always tried to expand, I think the problem historically is that all of the surrounding Arabs have always given Israel a really good reason to do so. That all of the territory that Israel has acquired, even if initially maybe we were thinking like, oh, it seems like that's kind of shady, the surrounding states have always given them either a casus belli for war or just a really valid reason to acquire territory. And we can go through any of the individual territory acquisitions and then argue the historical context around this, but I feel that very strongly about all the territory that Israel has acquired.
Yeah, but you begin from the premise that it's illegal to acquire land by force, right?
Well, what do we mean when we say that? So I think that one thing that we run into is we take a modern framing of the issue and then we retroactively superimpose this on Israel-Palestine, and then we try to make arguments that I don't think make the most amount of sense. So let me say this. So Resolution 242 agreed with you that you don't take land through military acquisition, right? And Israel made a commitment to give some territory back. Now they fought very hard for the wording on that, not all of it, but to return some territory back after the 67 war. But the issue is that the initial territory that was acquired was all through military conquest, which makes this particular situation very murky to sort out. So in 48, there was no country in mandatory Palestine. Well, in 47, there was no country. In 48, when Israel declared independence, they were the only country that existed in mandatory Palestine. All of the other acquired territory came through military conquest. Syria moved in from the north. Jordan took the west bank of the River Jordan, and Egypt took the entire Sinai and the Gaza Strip. Now, all of that territory, Israel is the only party there that technically kind of was owed that territory because that was the only country that emerged from the mandatory Palestine period. All of the other neighbors around her took that territory through conquest. And nobody seemed to care that much then. They all called to go back to the partition plan borders. But then once the Six-Day War happened in 67 and Israel conquered all the territory, now people are like, well, hold on. You can't have territory acquired through conquest. You need to give that back. We'll give it back to who?
The idea here, and this is a common narrative that people say, right? Which is, no one cared when the Arabs had the occupied territory. No one cared when Jordan was occupying East Jerusalem. It's only when Jews got it, right? Which is a compelling argument. It's just not accurate. I mean, part of it is the default position in 1948, from 1948 to 1967, the Arab world was that Israel was not a legitimate state.
Yep.
And they were holding that land with the intention of returning it to the Palestinian people and returning all of historic Palestine to them, not just the Golan, not just Gaza, not just the Sinai, not just East Jerusalem, but that all of these historical lands, all of Mandate Palestine, will return to the Arabs or to the Palestinians. Now that's obviously, in retrospect, probably not. It's somewhat quixotic, but that was the thought process. So the Arab position wasn't, it's okay if we have it, it's not okay if Jews have it. It was the default position after 1967, after Israel attained so much more land, was that this was in a military occupation. And again, that this land had to be ultimately returned. I get the idea of saying we can't take old frameworks and apply them, but these aren't ancient frameworks. I mean, the no land, the idea of not acquiring land through force is one of the spoils of World War I. I mean, the formation of the League of Nations, the idea that we don't have empires anymore, but we have nations is fundamentally to avoid this very thing. And even though, again, the United States wasn't part of it, other civilized nations were. And by 1948, it was very clear. And you're right, when you bring up 1967 and UN Resolution 242, and we could also, 242 and 338 kind of operated in tandem with one another. One, to say, hey, we're going to stop all belligerent activity. We're going to stop all fighting. And then second, to say, hey, we're going to respect the territorial integrity of Israel. That's important. And that's what the right to exist discourse was. That's what the right to exist meant. It didn't mean the right to
respect the territorial integrity of, are we talking about 67 or?
Yeah, I'm talking about UN Resolution 242.
Okay.
I'm saying it was a post 1967 war determination that was effectively saying we need to respect Israel's territorial integrity. I.e., Israel it was the first affirmation of Israel's right to exist. That discourse obviously got co-opted later to mean something else, to mean exist as a Jewish state and all these other things. But at the core, it meant territorial integrity. It meant you can't again, we're not taking Israel by force. Israel's here to stay. And even Martin Luther King is talking about Israel, right? He's using that same language of 242, the right to exist, meaning territorial integrity. And so we were kind of all on the same page as a global community about what that meant. But what's the territory, right? It didn't mean the Golan. It didn't mean the Sinai. And we know in the 70s, obviously after the October War and other things, we saw the return of some of that land. But fundamentally, the idea here was that a Palestinian state would have to exist at least partly on the land that was previously designated to them prior to the 1967 war. And what has happened is Israel has effectively said, we're never giving it back. They don't say that. They just never give it back.
I think that the timelines on like what everybody is saying about these particular lands, I think it's really important. So again, for Resolution 242, I don't think that it ever explicitly calls for, like, it doesn't call for the creation of like a Palestinian state or even ensures a Palestinian state. The language just says, I think a rightful or a just resolution, I should know the exact words, to the refugee problem is essentially what the Palestinians get relegated to, is like the refugee problem. I don't think even self-determination is initially brought up in that. I think that later on, I think in the late 60s or early 70s, I think the PLO and Israel through their negotiations will start to re-recognize 242 as saying like, okay, well maybe this can include some right to self-recognition, or I'm sorry, to self-determination. But I think what 242 has meant has kind of changed as time has gone on. And I think there's been a lot of ambiguity historically what it means. So for instance, another thing too is people will say like, oh, 242 came out, everybody agreed that people have a right to their territory, et cetera, et cetera. Right after Resolution 242, there was the...
242 says withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict.
Yes. So that's
the important part though, right? It also says termination of all claims of or states of belligerency and respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries free from threats or acts of force.
Correct. But when Eshkol, when the prime minister of Israel, when they were fighting over the wordage for 242, that was very particular. It wasn't withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from all territories occupied. It just says from territories occupied in the recent conflict. When they would later negotiate peace with Sadat after Yom Kippur, Israel's contention was, well, we've actually satisfied our obligations under 242 because we gave some territories back that were occupied in the recent conflict. That's what I mean when I say that I feel like the definitions of 242 and what those territories meant, because it doesn't say all territories. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's very interesting. But again, that's sort of like the interpretation of international law that we were differing on when we were talking about what's going on in Gaza right now. Is like, the reasonable interpretation, I think, and the general global interpretation of UN Resolution 242 was that Israel would withdraw from territories. It didn't mean some territories or just
nobody knew what it meant. That's why nothing particular was laid out, right? Because keep in mind, even the prior boundaries were only ones that weren't even recognized in 48. Because after 67, after the 6-Day War, there was literally the Khartoum Conference where every single Arab state said no recognition, no peace, and it was no recognition, no peace, and no trade. What were the three no's? No recognition, no peace, no land, maybe. But like the Arab states had explicitly made it clear in Cairo that they were not, or in Khartoum, that they were not going to be negotiating with Israel or recognizing her on any such terms. Especially after that humiliating war, there was no way they were ever going to. Negotiations.
I disagree with that interpretation of the Khartoum resolution.
Of the three no's, where they said we're literally never going to recognize.
That's not what they said. So the three no's were no peace, no recognition, and no negotiations.
Yeah, but no recognition is.
Yeah, but so again, I'm going to pull up. I just want to pull up the text of it.
Yeah, sure.
It wasn't no peace. It was no formal peace treaty. It wasn't no negotiation. It was no direct negotiations, and it wasn't. And it wasn't that there was no recognition. It was no de jure recognition.
Sure, I actually agree with you. I think that's
that's a very different representation of it than saying we don't want any peace, we don't want any recognition, we don't want any.
I agree with you. I super agree with you. I like you brought this up. It's very true. It wasn't that they wanted no peace whatsoever. I think part of the tragic history of Israel and the surrounding Arab states, I think, is both of these sides put themselves on trains that are inevitably headed to crash into each other, and they always do this by thriving in these ambiguous agreements and in these ambiguous statements with the hopes that they can leverage these down the line. So when you say no peace with Israel, it's not that they don't want any peace whatsoever. It's that if peace comes, it might not be official. It might be a rigid cold peace where they have some sort of just a ceasefire with no economic negotiations, and it might be a peace that leaves open future negotiations for either more military conflict, more land, or whatever. I think especially at 67, keep in mind, 67 was, puny, historically weak and hook-nosed, evil Jewish people somehow had militarily beaten all of these Arab states in the third war at that point. They were not in a position where they would have ever acquiesced to Israel owning territory there in any official sense. So I agree. They don't mean no peace like, oh, we'll never be peaceful. They just mean like, whatever peace we have, it is always going to be conditional on your ability to cooperate with us in this region. And that leaves it always open for future conflict, which unfortunately, well, for the Arabs, unfortunately for...
I would take it a step further, though. I think it was less abstract than that. I think it was no formal peace treaty until we have the formation of a state, of a legitimate Arab state. It wasn't just this abstract like carrot and stick thing. It was we recognize your territorial integrity, right? But we're not going to say formal recognition until what? There's an until there's a formation of a state, etc. Give me 1 second.